fortunate that Shisham has a very talented membership, and Tali is a tiny example of that. And we're eager to learn from you today.
Hi everyone. So this lecture tonight is going to have three main parts. The first part, I'm going to do a brief overview of the history of the Hebrew book. The second part will be talking about colophons of scribes and their manuscripts. I'll define all of those terms very shortly. And the third, I'm going to talk about handwritten inscriptions written by owners of books in their printed books. So just first, a quick note about the category that we're discussing. I mostly say Hebrew books, but that's not entirely accurate. There's a debate about what we should call this category and what books fall into this category. Probably Hebraic book would be a little more accurate because that would include both books in Hebrew and also books in other languages and Hebrew characters such as Yiddish or Ladino or Judeo-Arabic. Okay, so I'm going to start with a scroll. There's lots to say that happened before scrolls, and cuneiform tablets, and papyrus, but we have to start somewhere, so I'm going to start with scrolls. So we're very familiar with scrolls. We use them pretty regularly in this building. So the definition of a scroll is really just a roll of parchment or paper with writing. It's often made of multiple pieces of parchment sewn together. On the slides you see is a Torah scroll that it's rolled from both directions. A scroll of Esther is rolled only from one direction. Among the earliest surviving Hebrew sources are the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we'll hear about next week, I think. So I'm not going to say very much about them, but they date from roughly the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE. So those are in the form of scrolls. Scrolls were very durable, but they had their drawbacks. So first of all, storage of scrolls is not the easiest. So this top picture here is a recreation of what someone thinks the Library of Alexandria looked like. And you can see how they would store the scrolls in these shelves with a little cubby hole for each scroll. And then on the front, which you can see here, there was a little tag saying what was inside the scroll. But it's not the easiest to arrange and put in. And also scrolls couldn't be that long. So often if a work was too long to fit into one scroll, it would be contained in multiple scrolls. And third, think about what happens, for example, if a Torah scroll is not in the right position. If you're, let's say, opening the Torah and it's the end of Beit, you want to go to the beginning of Devarim. It takes a lot of effort, it's pretty annoying. So the form of a codex solves a lot of these problems. The codex, plural codices, is the shape of a book that we're all familiar with today. It's made up of sheets of parchment or paper that are folded and cut and stacked and sewn together. And so here you see the different shapes of paper, and here you can see more how they're stacked and then sewn together and then bound. So storage of codices is much easier than scrolls. You can just stick them on a shelf. There's a lot less wasted space. They can hold a lot more text than a scroll can. But most importantly, you can reference an earlier part of the book while you're later in the text. And that represents a significant development in the way that you can access information. Here's another close-up of quires. A quire is a gathering of pages that's then stacked. So you can see just the quires stacked within a binding. So the codex was first developed around the 1st century CE and was widely adopted by Christians. And it basically replaced the scroll by the 5th century. The Jews were a little more hesitant to adopt it. They kept using scrolls until the 7th, 8th century, and then they adopted the codex, although we still use scrolls for ritual purposes. The earliest surviving Jewish Hebrew codices date from the late 9th, early 10th centuries, mostly from the Near East or North Africa. They're mostly Masoretic Bibles. Another important group of documents is the Cairo Geniza. It's from around this period or a little bit later. Also not going to get into it because there's too much to say. Yes?
Was there any controversy about using the codex for the Torah, and was there like a back and forth, and we ultimately decided no, we want to stick with the scroll?
So I'm not sure if that's documented. Certainly later in the transition from manuscript to print, which I'll get to, there was definitely controversy about that, but I'm not sure. Good question. Okay, so there's two main types of codices I'm going to discuss tonight. The first is a manuscript codex, the second is printed. So the definition of a manuscript is just written by hand. So a scroll, like a Torah scroll, is a manuscript scroll. But a manuscript codex is what was pretty common in like the Middle Ages. So the production of a manuscript codex was really expensive and took a really long time. It's hard to come by exact figures, but two examples of figures that I've come across in my classes and readings. So in Florence, between the years 1300 and 1450, a book cost at least 20 ducats, which is about as much as a house would cost. And a school teacher would earn less than that in an entire year. So it was certainly a luxury good that most people did not have access to. And another stat that I like quoting, in the year 1300, the biggest library in Europe was at the University of Paris, and it had a whopping 600 volumes. That was the biggest library in Europe. So it really was a valuable luxury object that most people just didn't have. So Christian manuscripts were often produced in a scriptorium, it was like a factory, I guess, for manuscripts by monks, at least until the middle of the 13th century. And you see in this image how a medieval scribe would have sat. So he's sitting at a desk, on a bench with a slanted desk that he's writing on, and above his head on a shelf is the exemplar of the book that he's copying from. And you see he's surrounded by other books and things. But Jewish manuscripts were not produced in these scriptoria, these factories. They were either produced by individual professional scribes who you would commission to write a book for you, or by an individual who wanted a copy of it for themselves. In that case, it would be much cheaper because you're paying for the parchment and ink, but not for the labor. I think slightly more than half of known medieval manuscripts were written by the person who wanted it, which is very, very different than Christian manuscripts. So many manuscripts were just plain text, but a lot of them were illuminated. And contrary to popular belief, medieval Jews did not interpret the second commandment as forbidding all forms of art. There were beautifully illuminated manuscripts, and different communities in different regions developed different artistic styles in their illumination. So this is an example of a more Ashkenazi, it's really blurry, Ashkenazi illumination style. This is the bird's head Haggadah, made in Germany around the year 1300. It's called the bird's head Haggadah because all the people in the Haggadah have the heads of birds instead of heads of people. Scholars have not really figured out why that is. Some theories, they're not very convincing, whatever. So this page, which is kind of blurry, is Dayenu, and you can see here, this is giving of the Torah at Sinai, this is the man falling. You can see actually God's hand coming out of the sky, which is a whole other issue. And this is the making of matzah, and you can see them stamping the holes into the matzah. I thought that was interesting. This is another example of an Ashkenazi illumination. So this is the Worms Machzor. It's a really impressive, beautiful manuscript currently in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And it's a really huge manuscript. And this actually has the oldest attestation of Yiddish that we know of. So in the initial word panel of a piyut here, there's a little poem written inside that says, "Let a good day shine for him who will carry this machzor to the synagogue," because it was just so heavy. It was really big. But this is also a beautifully illuminated machzor. Where is it?
What year?
1272.
Okay, it's a little bit low.
Yeah, 1272. Second volume was 1280. So then, within the Sephardic environment, there were two main types of illumination that flourished. So the first is more of these narrative cycles. So at the beginning of a lot of these illuminated Haggadot, there'd be a bunch of pages of just a narrative cycle telling either the story of the Exodus from Egypt, or maybe even starting from Genesis, from the creation of the world, and going through to the Exodus. So this is from the Golden Haggadah, which is made in Barcelona around the year 1320. It's one of the most lavishly illuminated manuscripts from this period, and if you see the background in each of the scenes, is made of gold leaf. So this was like really expensive to commission. And the illumination is pretty similar to a lot of the Christian illumination of the period, and maybe was done at a Christian workshop. There's one scholar who thinks that this was commissioned by a woman for a number of reasons, but one of which is that Miriam and the women singing on their shir are featured very prominently and are much larger than any other figures on the page, but whatever. And the other approach that was common within the Sephardic environment was an aniconic approach, which did not have any depicted figures. This was influenced by all of the Islamic illumination tradition. So in these manuscripts, you get a lot of these geometric or vegetative patterns and designs. So this is a carpet page from a Bible that was produced in Lisbon, but by a scribe who was in Spain beforehand. Again, you see the gold leaf, so this was also pretty expensive to commission.
Is there anywhere local you can see a picture of that?
I wrote my undergrad thesis on this Bible, so I have a lot more to say about it, but not in this context. This is also from this manuscript. But another feature of this aniconic group is the use of micrography. Micrography is actually the only uniquely Jewish art form that was originated within the Jewish art world. So micrography means making designs out of words. So to see this whole frame, and these designs here, you can see it a little better here, the like snake wrapping around the pole, they're all made out of words. So this was actually also done in Ashkenaz, but it was very common in Sephardic Bibles as well. And just like the style of illumination changed by region, the script of the Hebrew also changed by region. And it often looked a lot like whatever else was being written in that region, like not in Hebrew. So this is an example of a 14th century Egyptian Hebrew and 14th century Egyptian Arabic. You see that the shape of the letters, that they're kind of rounder, like square off a little bit as they curve up. It kind of looks like the Arabic, and this is an example of Italian Hebrew versus like Humanist Latin, and it's much like rounder and like squatter. There aren't things sticking up in the same way. And there are many other examples of this. This is just two examples, but there are many different Hebrew scripts. Some of them are easier or harder to read because of the script that we are familiar with today, which is for lots of reasons. Okay. Now we've gotten to the printing press. So Gutenberg famously invented movable type in the year 1450 and published his Bible in the year 1455. So his book, his Bible, sold for 30 florins, which was still about 3 years' wages for an average clerk. So it was still cheaper than commissioning a scribe to work for, let's say, a year on a manuscript that would have been this elaborate. But it was still pretty expensive at the beginning of the printing press. It wasn't cheap just yet. In the first 50 years of printing, more books were produced than had been produced until that point in the Western world. So the amount of, just the number of books that are flooding the market was a considerable change, but they weren't really ready for that. So Gutenberg's press goes out of business soon after he publishes his Bible, and that happens to a lot of the early printing presses. The market just wasn't able to sell, like there weren't 300 people in Gutenberg's town who had the money to buy his Bible. And it took some time until the printing industry learned to tap into existing trade markets to expand their pool of potential buyers and actually sell their books. And one last note about this Bible. Early printer books were designed to look like manuscripts. There was this new form of book that was coming out of nowhere and people didn't know what to do with it and they were kind of suspicious. So the printers were trying to invoke a manuscript because that was a form of knowledge that people knew and trusted. And actually, if you look at this edition, this version of the Gutenberg Bible, which is at the Library of Congress, the early printers only printed in black ink. So the red and the blue that you see here was added by hand afterwards. So this is actually like an interesting mix of printing and manuscript. And that was very common in early printed Yes.
The paper that was used, and when you're moving from one form to another, what was the weight, or what was the difference there?
So yeah, so paper was also the transfer from parchment to paper also made it a lot cheaper. Paper was developed in China earlier, but started to become more popular, I think around the 14th and 15th century in Europe. But they still would print on parchment, like fancy editions given to like monarchs who are sponsoring your edition of whatever would often be printed on parchment. So that certainly doesn't go away, but the use of paper makes it a lot cheaper for sure. Okay, so this is a woodcut depicting what Gutenberg's printing press would have looked like. So there's three, at least a 3-person job. There's more people working here, but the first step is to set the type. So you see this guy here, it's like a table with boxes, and he pulls the letters that he wants and puts them on a piece of paper and like sets the type of the page they're going to print that day. Then it goes over here, and this guy has these like 2 handle things, and he inks the type, so he like spreads a layer of ink on it. And then this guy takes an empty piece of paper, sticks it on top of that. They like pull the letter down, lift it up, and they take out the page that has writing on it, and then it goes into this stack, and then they take a new one. So they basically set the type for a page, do it all day, and then let them dry, and then the next day they reset the type for the next page. So it actually takes a long time. It's like, it takes a while to get a return on your investment when you're making a book.
So they didn't save the type for the page, so they would take the type apart.
After that page, right. So, and it wasn't, like they usually, a print run was limited to like between 300 and 1,000 copies. Partially because I think the maximal number of times you could press down on this press thing was like 1,500 times a day. So you like would not have more than a 1,500 print run until like 19th century industrialization of the printing press. Because it wasn't worth extending the amount of time that you're investing in this book without anyone giving you any money for buying it by doing the same page 2 days in a row. Yeah.
Do you know of any contemporary studies of the use of frequency of letters in English?
We don't.
Or German?
We don't. Although the standardization of language also has a lot to do with printing press. And there's a printer in Italy, if I'm looking at his name right now, Aldine, who is like responsible for standardizing a lot of the punctuation that we use now, and like the semicolon versus the actual colon versus the period. Now this wasn't standard until this point, but he's put out these like very honorable edition of the classics, and in that process standardize that. But we can try to find studies of the usage of letters. So yeah, this was pretty grueling work, and they would work really long hours and really hard. So the Jews were pretty quick to adopt this technology as opposed to the Codex. The first Hebrew books were probably printed in Rome between 1469 and 1473. The first dated Hebrew book, meaning the book that we know what year it was printed, is from 1475 from southern Italy, from Reggio di Calabria. So this is the like 3rd oldest dated Hebrew book that I brought a book from. So this is an edition of the Torah Orach Chaim, printed in Italy in 1476. And at the end, the printer like signs his name in a colophon, which we'll get to in a minute. And when he's describing what he's doing, he like doesn't really have a vocabulary to describe the printing press because it's so new. So he describes himself as someone who writes with many quills without a miracle. Or he like doesn't know how to explain that he can make 300 pages of the same page in one day. It's not miraculous, I promise. It like doesn't have the words to say. It takes a little while before they like figure out words to describe what they're doing. So in addition to Italy, which would remain the center of Hebrew printing into the 16th century, there were presses that were operating in Spain and Portugal as well before the Jews' expulsion from those countries. And when the Jews were expelled, they brought their presses with them. So the first presses to be opened in Istanbul and Fez and a number of other places were Hebrew printing presses that were brought by Jews who'd left Spain. So this is an example of a book printed in Lisbon in 1489, Nachmanides, the nice border around the edge. And I think there's also a lot of scholarship about like tracing the traveling of these borders, and they were used first in Latin books and then given to the Jewish printers to use in their books, and you can like kind of trace where they went. And then in the mid-17th century, Amsterdam became the center of Hebrew printing, rather than Venice. They remained an important center of printing until at least the middle end of the 18th century, if not longer. This is the Tali of the Amsterdam Haggadah from 1695, and a lot of the images inside of this Haggadah became very standard images that were included in many, many editions of the Haggadah printed after the fact, after this time. Two more quick notes before we move on to part 2. So the first one is literacy rates. It's really, really hard to figure out literacy rates. It's like hard to come by data about that. The consensus is that it was pretty low at the time, and many scholars will claim that Jewish literacy was higher than the general society. Two little bits of information that could support that. So this is an image from the Barcelona Haggadah, which was made in Barcelona about 1340. It's a depiction of a family having a Passover Seder. You see the father here, and he has a book in front of him, and then two of the children also have books in front of them. And given what we said about the scarcity and expense of books, and also low literacy rate, this is, I think, a good indication of the value that Jewish culture put on literacy and books as a vehicle of transmitting information. The second is just a really fun quote from a Spanish rabbi from the 14th, 15th century. A person's wisdom only reaches as far as his books. Therefore, one should sell all that he owns and buy books. So I don't think you should sell all of your belongings to buy books, even though I do like books.
We have libraries now.
What?
We have libraries now.
That's true. So there's actually interesting scholarship about the development of public and private libraries, but which might have developed in Spain among Jews. But again, this is just an indication of the value that at least this rabbi was placing on knowledge and books as transmitters of knowledge. And the second note is about the history of reading. So it used to be that reading was done out loud. This makes sense, first of all, because of the expense of books, and second of all, because of low literacy rates. It wasn't practical or even useful to have books for everyone in the room, so one person would stand and read to everyone in the room. In the early Middle Ages, this started to change, and reading shifted from oral to silent, to private reading. And in the 15th century, for the first time, the library at Oxford adopted the rule of silence. Because before that, people would come to the library and read out loud whatever they came to the library to read. But in the 15th century, they adopted the rule of silence for the first time. So, fun fact.
And to this very day.
What?
And to this very day.
And to this very day. You get clear as if you talk in the library. Okay, part 2. So now we're going to talk about scribal colophons. So, definition of colophon is an inscription at the end of a book, usually including information about its completion. They're usually relatively formulaic. They say the name of the scribe, the date, the place. It would be great if they all said all three of them, so they don't always. And sometimes there's other information. And they can often be very interesting because while for the rest of the book that the scribe is copying, he's literally copying from his exemplar that he was told to copy from. In the colophon, he has a little bit more freedom of expression. And sometimes they just jot down whatever date and place and their name, but sometimes they express themselves and tell us what they're thinking about or things that are bothering them. There's examples of Christian scribes complaining in Latin about their awful work conditions and saying, "Thank God I'm done with this." And sometimes these would be beautifully illuminated. This is an example of a colophon from the Lisbon Bible, which is a really beautifully illuminated Bible. It's currently in the British Library with this really beautiful Italian floral border. Whereas this, for example, this is the end of the text he was copying, and he added these 3 lines, which notice how hard they are to read. It's really hard to read. So that's not a very elaborate note, but he just wanted to add something.
Is that different? Would you use the word colophon for like if the author adds, like Ramban does this a lot, like, you know?
So you would say, I think it would specify author's colophon. I think within manuscripts the assumption is that it's the scribe, but you could have an author's colophon for sure. And then you could also have a printer's colophon, which is what we saw before, with him saying, I write with many quills. That was a printer's colophon.
Gotcha.
And you can have more than one in a book. You can have the author's colophon and the printer's colophon.
Right.
Okay, so this is just a fun example before we get to the main topic I'm going to talk about. So Hebrew manuscripts were usually written by men, although we know of 6 manuscripts that were written by a woman, 3 of them by the same woman. But she was really cool. Her name was Paula, the daughter of Rabbi Abraham the scribe, so she probably learned from her father. And in this case, she describes how a relative of hers, who was a rabbi, or Menachem, basically begged her to write this manuscript for him. And in another colophon, she explains that she's writing the manuscript for her son. So she was clearly, and if you look at her script, she's like a very talented scribe. So this is the end of the text, and this is her really long colophon at the end. So that's just a little fun fact. So this colophon's from 1293. She lived in Rome. So yay, Paula. Okay. So the main group of colophons I want to talk about are from the Spanish exiles. So the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492. A lot of them went to Portugal. They were then expelled from Portugal in 1497. They then spread out to various other places, Ottoman Empire, Italy, Israel, lots of places. So I was interested in looking at the colophons written by scribes who had been expelled from Spain to see how they expressed their experiences of the expulsion, the trauma they'd experienced. And while I was looking, I found a lot more than I was expecting. And while I was looking through them, I split them into 3 different categories, kind of to help me understand how they were internalizing the experience and then expressing it. So the first category is chronological, where they use the expulsion as a chronological reference point, which we'll see in a second. The next is an identifying reference, where the scribe identifies himself as a person who had been exiled from Spain. And the third is an emotional description of what happened to him. So I'm going to bring one of each of these categories just to give an example of this phenomenon. So this is the first one. I'm just going to show you a picture of it before I give you the transcription. So this is like on its own page. You'll notice it has a nice border. So this is all the colophon. So this is it typed out, and I'll have the English in a second. So this is actually a 2-volume manuscript. The first half was written in 1491 in Spain, so that's before the expulsion. And the colophon is just normal, doesn't say anything about this. And then the second volume was written in 1494 in Portugal. And I'll switch to the English here. And when he signs, I guess I'll go to the Hebrew first. When he signs the date, he specifies "Shtei shanim achari hagirush meCastilia." Right? I finished this on whatever date, 2 years after the expulsion from Castile. So for this scribe, the expulsion from Spain becomes a date from which he references future dates, I guess. It was like such a meaningful experience that then you would count years from that event. And this was true in many manuscripts after the expulsion. I think the latest one I found was like 13 years after the expulsion. They're still counting years since they've been expelled. And also in many printed calendars, they would often print these like calendars that you hang up on the wall, called a broadside. And they would often have this many years from the creation of the world, and this many years from giving the Torah on Mount Sinai. So this was also in the list of things that we are counting the number of years from for like over 100 years after the expulsion.
In the Hebrew, the Samach Tet, does that stand for Sephardi Tahor or something else?
So I was told by someone that it's not Sephardi Tahor, that it's actually like Siman Tov, that like he should be well.
That's probably, okay.
But
That's great. It seems a little anachronistic that it would be.
yeah.
Right.
Okay, so that was the chronological reference, and again, it happened for a long time after. So the second category was identifying, where it becomes part of the person's identity that he was exiled from Spain. So this scribe, Moshe ben Chaim Akrish, he's in southern Italy. He's writing this manuscript in the year 1520, although we have a lot of his manuscripts mostly liturgical, from around that time period. So when he signs his name, he signs it as Moshe ben Chaim Akrish Sfaradi Migalut Yerushalayim Asher Haya B'Sfarad. So for the exile of Jerusalem that was in Spain. So 2 notes about that phrase. First is that Galut Yerushalayim Asher B'Sfarad, the exile of Jerusalem in Spain, is a quote taken from Ovadia. And this phrase was adopted by the Spanish Jewish community as evidence that they were like an ancient Jewish community that came straight from Israel to Spain, and they like have a very royal heritage from the Davidic line. They felt like they were better than a lot of other Jews, and that continued afterwards, after they were expelled. But this was a phrase from Ovadia that they kind of adopted about themselves. But Moshe ben Chaim Akrish, the scribe here, makes an important change in the phrase. He turns into the past tense, right? Instead of Galut Yerushalayim Asher B'Sfarad, he says Asher Haya B'Sfarad, which was in Spain. And there he's really expressing the sense that a lot of Spanish Jews had that they were exiled twice, once from Jerusalem and once from Spain. And they really carried that with them to the many communities that they went to after the expulsion. Okay, and then the more fun ones are the emotional ones. So the earliest emotional description I found was from just a year later, and a lot of these are really mournful in tone. There's a bunch of them, but I just had to pick one, so I picked the best one. So I'll go to the English because the Hebrew is a little bit hard. So this is a medical treatise written in 1507-08 by a scribe Shmuel ben Yom Tov ibn Musa, who's called Maraj. So in his Kalafan he writes, I am currently residing here as a result of the chaos and vicissitudes of time, for I have abandoned my house, I have deserted my inheritance that I had from the days of old in the kingdom of Spain, since the day that we, all the Jews, were expelled at the decree of the king in the year 492. But because the couch is too short for stretching out and productivity is better than praise, I raised my hand in battle and my fingers in war against this bad time to complete my mission and fulfill my potential to write books of medicine. And then, etc. I have signed my name here, so says the one whose soul is burdened from the hardships of time. And then he signs his name. So there's a number of things that are very notable about this description. First of all, it's like really mournful, and just the way he's describing the chaos and vicissitudes of time. He deserted his inheritance. You can really tell that it was like he was really sad about it. He also quotes a lot of biblical verses. You see here Jeremiah, Isaiah, Psalms. The phrase of the decree of the king is very reminiscent of the book of Esther. So he's really framing the experience of the Jews of Spain in the context of biblical history. And yeah, so you see the passion here. And then I think what's inspiring about this individual is that his response to this bad time is to write more books of medicine, to contribute something positive to the society around him, despite all the bad experiences that he's had. So I found that a little bit inspiring. And this is the actual Kalafan. Starting from here, Nishwan, see it there. Also really hard to read. Okay, that was part 2. Now we're going to move on to part 3, which is owner inscriptions. So this third section is taken from a project I worked on this summer, trying to trace individual copies of printed books through time and space. So once you move from a manuscript to a printed book, there are many, many copies of a single imprint, as opposed to a manuscript where each one is unique. So something that we were trying to look at in this project is to trace individual copies of a book. And eventually, if you have enough information, you can see the spread of a work through time and space, but that's way in the future. So we mentioned earlier that reading wasn't always done silently, and the process of reading is constantly changing over time. So in the past, reading was much more interactive than it is now. And in fact, there was a law passed in Venice soon after the printing press was introduced there that made it illegal to print a book without wide enough margins or on bad paper that you couldn't write notes on, because that was so integral to the process of reading that it was illegal. And the entire print run would be recalled if you did it. So this summer I spent a lot of time at the Scribes Institute for Jewish Learning and Leadership. looking at their collection of early modern Hebrew printed books, looking for owners' inscriptions. This was one of the first pages I encountered. It was pretty overwhelming because there's like a lot of stuff going on here. But turns out a lot of it's like doodling and scribbles and like people writing the same thing all over and over again, which like everyone does when they're bored in class. And I think this one is someone saying that you're not supposed to write your name on things, except for in this case, I don't want someone to steal my book, so I'm going to write my name. But anyway, I was interested in looking at people's inscriptions to see what I could learn about people's relationships to their books and where the books had been, and anything else I could learn about the books from the inscriptions of their owners. So I'm going to now bring just a bunch of examples. There isn't necessarily a unifying idea, but just there are some fun examples. So this is a commentary on the Torah written by Shlomo ben Melech, printed in Amsterdam in 1660. On the title page, which you see here, and also on the front page of almost every chapter in the book, is an inscription, which I transcribed and translated. So, Shayach Beit Midrash Shel Harav Hagon HaChasid Ibno Chayal Halacha. This belongs to the Beit Midrash of the brilliant and pious rabbi of blessed memory. So I don't know who this is talking about, because there's no name. But this clearly belonged to some type of Torah learning institution, and the institution wanted to remind the students, don't take this book home. And they wanted to remind them on the front of each chapter, don't take this book home. So again, I don't know where this book was, but we can tell it was in some type of institution with students who maybe were prone to taking books home. This book can also tell us about the fate of books after World War II. So on the inside of the front cover is a booklet of the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction. This organization was a New York-based umbrella organization that collected and distributed airless or unidentifiable cultural materials to institutions in the US and Israel and Europe and Latin America after the Holocaust if they couldn't find the actual owners. So this book came to Chicago between 1949 and 1952, along with 7,500 other books that Scribes acquired in this way. And there are lists of all the various institutions and how many books they got. I think out of this, 176 of them were considered rare books. So, a little snippet of modern history in here. Okay, so this is a book written by the Radbaz, or Rabbi David Ibn Avi Zimra, a 16th century scholar who lived in Spain and Israel and Fez and Egypt, traveled a lot. So here, the owner, this inscription, which I had to have a friend help me read because it was really hard to read. So the inscription reads, Kaniti liadi, I don't know what this word is, Mimamun ma'aser, B'shisha asar gushi achitzi, Hatzair b'nemin chamuli. So I bought this, unclear, with my ma'aser money for 16.5 gushi, the young Benjamin chamuli. So the owner is telling us how much he bought the book for, but he's also telling us that he used his maaser money to buy it, right? And maaser money is usually money that's put aside for charitable causes. So that's very fascinating that he's using this money put aside for charity for buying Hebrew books. I guess halachic books, it's a book of responsa, but it tells us a little bit about how he was thinking about the religious value that learning had in the context of charity. I actually found another book of responsa that was also bought by the same guy, also with his maaser money. And then both books ended up in the collection of Rabbi Mendel Wallman of Virashov, who lived in Jerusalem at some point in the 19th century, and they both ended up at Scribes. So these books have been traveling together at least since the 19th century, if not earlier, because I don't actually know when this inscription was written. So that's something else that these types of inscriptions can help us learn about books traveling together and maybe to recreate the collections of individuals who were traveling around collecting books. And here's another one that I couldn't read at all. But a lot of these have a lot of inscriptions. This is another fun one. So this is the Korban Netanel, which was written by Nathaniel Wheel, who lived from 1687 to 1769. And he was the chief rabbi of the German city of Karlsruhe, starting from 1750 until his death in 1769, and then his son Tia took over. This work is a commentary on Asher ben Yechiel's writings, and it was published for the first time in Karlsruhe, where he was the chief rabbi, in 1755. It was actually the first Hebrew book to be printed in that city. So this inscription is signed by two people. Tia, who's, you can see his name up here, and Rabbi Eli, who I don't know who he is. So Tia Wheel was the son of the author, and identifies himself as the chief rabbi of Karlsruhe, which means it was after his father's death. He explains that he was traveling and is selling a copy of this book to Rabbi Eli, who's the chief rabbi of Salzburg. And then Rabbi Eli signs his name under the inscription. So this short inscription captures a moment in time that is really interesting for a lot of reasons. It's a moment of exchange between two scholars who are both leaders of their respective Jewish communities. They're exchanging scholarship, presumably some form of money, and the book. But it also reveals a lot about the way that books were disseminated in this period. So I'm sure that the Wheel family utilized normal trade routes to distribute the book, but clearly, Tia Wheel is also traveling around with copies of his father's books that he hopes to sell to other rabbis or scholars he meets on the road. And who knows, maybe there are other copies of this floating around that also have an inscription from him to a different rabbi who he met when he was traveling. So maybe one day I'll find one.
What's the stamp say?
I'm sorry?
Stamp?
That was like a later library. I'm not sure, I don't think I figured that out. Yeah,
Right.
good question. But later.
Right.
And yeah.
Does it say the date on the of when it was translated?
Yes, I think. No, it doesn't. Never mind, it doesn't. I don't know. So I know it was after he was chief rabbi, after his father's death, so that's from 1770, and he died in 1805. So it was sometime between 1770 and 1805. Okay, and last example I'll bring. We often find evidence of non-Jewish encounters with Hebrew books. So in this case, you can see the signatures of 3 Christian censors. They sign their name and the year that they're censoring. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the Catholic Church put out lists of books which were banned completely, and then lists of books that needed to be censored before they were authorized for use. And they would list the specific phrases that needed to be crossed out by the censor before they'd give the book back. And often Jewish converts to Christianity would be the ones who would do this censoring because they knew Hebrew and were familiar with Jewish literature. And often books would be censored more than once. I don't know if they didn't trust the previous ones, or it was a new, everyone would give all your books in and we'll censor them and give them back. So in this example, you can see 3 signatures. The first one is, I'm not going to pronounce the name, but Camilo Yagel. He was a censor who was really active between 1611 and 1613 in Italy. Second one, Frater Renatus, 1625, and the third one I couldn't read. So this is an example of a Christian encountering Hebrew books. There was also a whole movement of Christian Hebraism, of Christian scholars who were interested in studying Hebrew for 2 basic reasons. First, as a way to get at the original language of the Bible, and second, to better convince the Jews to convert. So it wasn't entirely embracing of Jews and Jewish culture, but it certainly led to increased interaction between Jews and Christians, as Christians hired tutors, who were usually rabbis or other Jewish scholars, to teach them Hebrew so they could access these texts.
Why would more than one censor have to inspect and sign up?
So I think the one reason that I could come up with is that there's a decree that the Jewish community has to give in all their books in 1613 and get them all censored. They do that. 1625 is a new decree. We have to give in all the new books. But they give all the books, and the censor has to go through all of it. And he signs his name, and I don't know if he actually looked through it again or not. He just saw that the other guy signed it and it was fine. Or maybe they put out a new guideline for what's allowed and what's not allowed. So there's Revised Standard. So there's a bunch of options. So increased Christian-Jewish interaction. So that's all I have for now. This is a relatively new field within history, studying the book as a material object that's traveling and interacting with people. But I think it could be meaningful for us to think about how we interact with our books or other objects in our daily life, and to see how that's the same or different as Jews hundreds of years ago who were reading many of the same books that we are reading today. So there's obviously a lot more to talk about. I skipped over a lot of things, but happy to answer any questions. Yes.
Is this what you're writing about or studying more? Or is this just a summer project? Or
Yeah, so I don't have a dissertation topic yet, but I hope to do something related to this.
Very cool.
You could say what the footprints project is.
Yeah, so what I worked on this summer is a database that was started by 3 professors and a librarian that I know. It's called Footprints, that's trying to trace Hebrew books through time and space. So a footprint of a book is that Rabbi Tia Wheel was selling it to Rabbi Eli at this time at this place. So we know it was here then. And eventually, it's a collaborative database, and eventually when there's enough information in this database, you can really see a lot about the spread of books and like what kind of books people are inscribing their names into. And you can see like a specific imprint, how that spread and where it was sent to, or a specific work and how many imprints there were and where it spread. So again, in the future when there's enough information in this database, which there isn't yet, but that's the idea. Yes?
And I thought this all seemed fascinating. Really, I mean, it's like new, so I feel like
Yeah, it's also new in the history field, but
But one of the things that reverberates in my mind, you said that the largest collection was at the University of Paris or Sorbonne. I don't know if it was one and the same at the time. But it was sort of surprising to me because I would have thought that the Vatican, because the church was producing these books, would have been a larger holder. Do you have any understanding? I mean, was it because of selling them to someone outside as opposed to?
so I'm not sure. It could be that the Vatican had more like records of things rather than like works that they were copying, and like more archival type material, but I'm not sure. That's a good question. Yeah, I know a little bit less about Christian books around that time. I know more about Hebrew books. Yes.
I was in the insurance business, and one broker from our department, he was getting ready to retire. And he showed me a list of Hebrew books that one of his clients had, that they were scheduled as fine arts. And I said, I want that account. I said, nobody else in this department would appreciate it. Because, I mean, I think we had a Jewish woman that worked in claims, but, none of the other brokers were Jewish.
Yeah,
So I did get that account.
That's exciting. I mean, it's certainly a big business now, and Sotheby's recently had a pretty big auction. There have been a few works that were sold for a lot of money. There was a illuminated Mishnah Torah that was copied in like 1547 or something in Italy. 2 volumes, other volumes in the Vatican. And the first volume is like a beautiful volume, and it was bought shared between 2 museums because like no one else had enough money to buy it. So they like made a deal beforehand and they'll like share it 50% of the time.
Yeah, she sold the majority of her collection when she moved from a townhouse to a co-op, and sold for a lot more than the appraised value.
Yeah, this is definitely a big business in current auction houses of Hebrew books and such.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tali.